So my job as an anthropologist is to, engage in a peculiar kind of pattern recognition. And the pattern that seemed to be emerging was counterintuitive and unexpected and a bit odd. But it seemed to me I could talk about it as a culturamatic. One of my first kind of data points was the work that Bud Cadell did for Mad Men. When the show was cresting in American culture, Bud had the brilliant idea of tweeting from the mailroom of the show. So while we were watching the characters on our screen, on the TV screen, and we were seeing things happen in the ad agency, Bud contrived to give us a stream of tweets as if from the mailroom. And so here's a guy who's, he knows all the people, the stars of the show, the people we see on the show. He's responsible indeed for delivering their mail. In point of fact, he's reading their mail, and he has privileged access to this world for which, so it's a transmedia proposition, extraordinarily clever. I thought, it made him an internet celebrity. He managed to break into Mad Men for the price of a Twitter account, which is to say, he managed to break into Mad Men for free. So I started to see these culturematics everywhere, and they seemed to me to have these cultural characteristics. They were cheap, they were experimental, clever, opportunistic. They made culture out of culture. They discovered value in the process. Again, this is just my attempt to build a category with which to try to capture these diverse things. And the question always is, when you look at these things pour out of our digitally enabled culture, this great profusion of innovation, are you looking at one thing or are you looking at many things? I think it's one thing, but it may be many things. I leave it to you to decide. So when I started thinking, this is a culturematic, I began to see it everywhere. And I thought I saw it in reports on PSFK, no less, coming out of a small town in Siberia where kids were protesting and the security forces were coming down on them, arresting them, beating them. And their response was to dress dolls as protesters and to put those in the middle of the town square. And they said to the security forces, listen, you're free to arrest these dolls if you wish. You're free even to beat them if you must. But in point of fact, most of the work of protest is registered, and most of the grief of our having to prosecute this by ourselves, by our own efforts, is spared us. The CDC, Center for Disease Control, is charged with the responsibility of making us get ready for disaster. So what they want us to do is to go to the hardware store and the grocery store one afternoon a year, and lay on water and food and so on. And nobody does it. I mean, how many people here have actually made ready for disaster? I bet it's like 2%. So somebody at the CDC said, well, what if we threaten them not with disaster, but with zombies? And it turned out this was fantastically successful. People who wouldn't get ready for a real disaster were quite prepared to get ready for a zombie attack. So I was on Brooklyn Bridge recently, and I saw these, as you will have done if you've been on the bridge. People are creating their own little memorials and locking them any place they can, often locking them to locks that are locked on the bridge. These locks are engraved. This is a do-it-yourself memorial. People are commandeering public space for this private memorial purpose. Clever, opportunistic, incredibly cheap, and really effective. This is Bill Winkenbach. He's the guy who several years ago in a Manhattan hotel room invented fantasy sports. And he manages to run fantasy sports, in fact, are fantastically cheap, and they have colonized the sports, the world of the sports enthusiasts so completely that now many fans have these conflicted feelings. Occasionally they're rooting for a home team, but they're also rooting for their fantasy sport team, and those two teams are playing one another. They're caught in this conflict. Bill Winkenbach and his friends thought so little of this wonderfully clever idea. So the idea here is the National Football League was throwing off a profusion of numbers, which numbers Winkenbach used to create an alternative sports reality. So it's a real reality, but it's totally virtual. It's now worth, if you take all the fantasy sports together, they're worth $3.5 billion in the American economy. These guys created they're part of the mixology trend that's been upon us for the last couple of decades, and their notion was that they wanted to create a bar downtown Manhattan, and they wanted to keep it completely secret, which they did. And in fact, they were so concerned on secrecy, they were worried that people might wander by and come on in. So they put a sign on the door that said employees only. So this is a market enterprise that's using secrecy to establish itself in the marketplace. In point of fact, you know what people in Manhattan are like. To have early warning of something totally obscure is a fantastically valuable cultural currency, and their fame preceded them, and they built an extraordinary brand in the process. This is somebody saying, images are too important to be made the confines of movie theaters and television sets, and they found a way to insinuate the moving image, in this case a big cat, onto the surfaces of Paris. Incredibly cheap, incredibly effective. Some people were unhappy that Tony Blair was allowed to tell his story in this form, and they said, geez, how do we take issue with a guy who controls access to the publishing industry? And what they did was move his book. When it began to appear in bookstores, they relocated it so that it told another story. So incredibly cheap, incredibly opportunistic, and I think very effective. People, seized upon these moribund booths, phone booths, for a new purpose. So these, it seems to me, we can talk about these as culturatics. It feels like it's a new category of cultural invention now that everybody's in on the game. And this notion of culturatic is my notion. Please, I'd be grateful for your thoughts and comments and further instructions in a book forthcoming in May. Thanks a million.